This video is about legislation and its impact on business. So there are a huge range of different laws and regulations that businesses have to adhere to in their day-to-day activities. We're just going to look at a few examples here across a range of different categories and some specific areas of legislation that businesses would need to think about. So we've got consumer protection regulations and legislation, such as the Sale of Goods Act, and that says that goods need to be of satisfactory quality, they need to be fit for purpose, and customers would have a right to a refund if a business is trying to sell them defective goods. There's the Trade Descriptions Act, which prevents businesses from making false or misleading claims when they're advertising their products. And then you've got employee protection legislation as well. So things like the national minimum wage, which varies depending on age categories. In the UK, it's actually called the national living wage when you get to 25 and above. That sits at around £9 an hour, and that goes down to lower levels of minimum wages at younger age groups. And it's illegal for employers to pay their workers below the national minimum or the national living wage. There's also laws to do with sick pay, maternity pay and paternity pay. So companies will have their own policies, and many of these will actually be more generous than the statutory minimums. But if you have to miss work because of sickness or because if you have a child, there are legal statutory minimums which employers have to pay their workers. And there's also laws around redundancy. So this is very different from dismissal or being sacked from your job, but it's when an employer needs to reduce the size of their workforce, and so essentially your job no longer exists. And there are laws relating to how they can do this, and that's to do with consultation, giving a notice period, and usually some form of redundancy pay as well. We've also got laws around the environment, so things like the Environmental Protection Act, and these are rules around the disposal of waste and how you can do that, and also controlling emissions and trying to reduce pollution. And we've got competition policy, so it's not in consumers' interests for one firm to have too much dominance over a market. Generally because they're going to start charging much higher prices in the absence of competition to stop them from doing that. So it's the role of the Competition and Markets Authority, or CMA, to investigate mergers, which could lead to excessive market power, and any situation really where you've got big businesses that might be exploiting consumers because of a lack of competition. And then finally here we've got health and safety regulations and legislation, including Health and Safety at Work Act, which sets out the responsibilities that employers have towards their employees, customers and the general public in terms of keeping them safe. Now, I've not gone into huge amounts of detail here on each of these individual pieces of legislation, but just given a bit of an overview or a summary. And the reason for that is because you don't need to know the absolute intricacies of each individual law, the date that it was set, and so on. But you need to have a good range of examples that you can refer to discuss the impact of legislation on businesses. And so generally speaking, businesses are not going to like legislation, or certainly excessive legislation. And that mainly is going to be because it's going to increase their costs. So you think the hoops that they might have to jump through to comply with health and safety laws, they might have to train their employees and put them on courses to get them to understand those laws. They might have to employ health and safety inspectors to get an overview across the company. Paying workers fair and minimum wages, disposing of their waste in the right way and reducing their emissions, all of these things are going to come with a cost. And when you see costs increase, then the natural next step is for profits to go down. And so that's going to be bad news potentially for businesses, but it could also be bad news for the employees working for them as well, because they might find themselves out of a job because the business can't afford to pay all of their staff the minimum wage, or they can't afford to do all these things, so they have to then think about cutting back on some of their staffing costs. But that doesn't mean to say that this legislation should not be in place, and clearly these laws and regulations are really important to protect consumers, to protect workers, to protect the environment and so on. And for the most part, those staff, those employees are going to be really happy about having their interests protected, about being paid a fair wage, about having rules regulating redundancy and sick pay and all of those different things. And it's going to therefore help with their motivation and their productivity. And that can then feed back into the businesses and be good news for the businesses, because having happy staff, having more motivated staff and having more productive staff is going to be good for business as well. And also, it's going to be quite important to level that playing field, because the majority of businesses are probably going to be trying to do the right thing. They're going to be trying to pay their staff a reasonable wage, not dispose of waste in unethical ways and things like that. So if you have these legislations in place, then it's going to stop those unethical businesses from getting an unfair advantage from not doing all of those things, which is going to be good news for the majority of businesses which are trying to do things correctly.